So I am going to talk to you tonight about my newest book, New England's General Stores, Exploring an American Classic, which came out this past fall. And I'm going to what might seem like a long-winded kind of preface into sharing with you some of my favorite general stores. But first, let me tell you what this book is not. I know this seems counterintuitive when you'd like people to buy your book. So, however, I believe in truth in advertising. So, here's what this book is not. It is not a comprehensive listing of New England's general stores. And I'm saying this now not like as part of some weird commercial thing. I'm telling you because it has everything to do with what I'm talking about tonight. Oddly enough, what this book isn't. It's not a comprehensive listing of New England's general stores. So if you wanted to go state by state and find where all the general stores are, this ain't the book. I don't think there is a book like that. I think you can find it online. But what the book is I was interested in exploring why this iconic New England institution went from almost disappearing, slowly by slowly, to making something of a comeback. This is what has intrigued me and made me want to write the book. So, you know, at Chronicle, folks know that in all my travels around New England to every corner of New England over almost 25 years now, there are basically two New England institutions that I cannot pass by and that are so ingrained in my natural, well, Dunkin' Donuts is also one of them, but that's not. And I'm going to take questions later, but I am going to head off what might be the first question. I can take care of that one right now. I don't have enough for everybody, but I've also been going since 4 a.m., so this is very helpful. But all kidding aside, the two New England institutions, one is a diner, but the other that I cannot pass by, that I've always been sort of, I don't know, just had this sense of kindredship with, is a New England general store. And about 15, 16 years ago, within the 20 years that less than doing Chronicle, that I noticed that diners seem to be making something of a comeback, right? If you go back to the 60s, was the low point. By the mid-60s, diners were disappearing left and right. It just wasn't something that, you know, people were into newer and maybe healthier to some extent, and diners were disappearing left and right. You get to the 80s, and there was this sense of, you know, it wasn't just diners, but like everything old, retro was cool again, and diners began to come back. And thankfully, they have kind of stabilized. And about a decade ago, I started to notice the same thing about general stores. That's what intrigued me. Why it was that, and the fact that there were whole libraries full of books about diners, so we didn't need another one. But general stores, there's been very, very little written about. And I was curious why it would be the general stores. Because when you think about it, if you want to go to a diner, right? If you are in the mood for a diner, if you have a favorite diner, if you want to stop for coffee, you're on the highway, you're going through a small town, you see like a diner like that. To me, that's like, oh, a beacon in the night. But if that's what you want to do, right? You really want to go to a diner, there's really no equivalent to a diner, right? You are either into a diner, which, by the way, is the single most democratic form of eating in the world, right? You sit at the counter, you could be sitting next to a stockbroker, you could be sitting next to a pipe fitter. It doesn't matter. That's what I love about diners and breakfast. Thing is, there's no equivalent to a diner. If that's what you want, that's what you got to go to a diner. General stores, anything you can buy in a general store nowadays, you can buy somewhere else. You can stop at the Quick Mart, 7-Eleven, CVS, Walgreens, whatever. There's nothing in a general store, 99.9% of them, that you can't find at someplace else, and guess what? Usually for less, right? So why would it be that they would make a comeback? It makes no sense commercially, none. But they have. It has nothing to do with what's on the shelves. Nothing. It has to do with what you feel when you go in, and I don't mean nostalgia or sentimentality. I mean what you find in a general store, and it's not what's on the shelves. That's what we're going to talk about tonight. That's why I wrote the book. So First, a little biology. Oh, what, you thought there was like no learning here tonight? So, this is an example of an endangered species, right, that was hunted to complete extinction. You will not find a dodo bird on the face of the earth today, right? This is an example, white rhino, of a currently endangered species that is not yet fully extinct. So is this. Now, in terms of the type of predator that hunted the dodo to complete extinction, there you go. When it comes to the predators who have threatened general stores with complete extinction, I'm going to tell you right now, I don't care what you think about general stores, you may love them, none of our hands are clean. You may have consorted with one of these predators recently. I have. Today, to be perfectly honest. So, right? Right. But guess what? The big box stores did not threaten general stores with extinction. They haven't helped. But the big box stores were not where the threat to general stores began. That's where we're going to start. It didn't begin with the big box stores. In fact, I chose these two modern iterations. In fact, the target is still in the design phase of the big boxes for a reason. To point out dramatically that these are very new compared to when general stores began to be threatened with extinction. How far back does it go? More than half a century. I'm going to show you what one of my favorite chroniclers of America's popular culture had to say when he recognized what was going on with general stores. So you're looking at John Steinbeck and his best friend, or I should say, I always say, like, I never met John Steinbeck's second wife, but I think it's safe to say that she probably didn't like to hear that Charlie was his best friend. At least you could say your best four-legged friend, right? So his best four-legged friend. And you may recall that from your high school English class, that in 1960, John Steinbeck and Charlie set off in a custom-built GMC pickup with the camper in the back to travel across America. Anybody know what, he called it Rocinante. Anybody know what that referred to? Librarians are excluded from this question because they know everything. Anybody? Anybody know what Rocinante referred to? Don Quixote's horse. Yeah, I didn't know that till I looked it up either, but I knew it sounded familiar. And in 1960, he and Charlie circumnavigated America. Look what John Steinbeck noticed over half a century ago. That the big towns were getting bigger, the villages smaller. Does that look a little blurry? No? Here, now it's like an optometrist. Better like this or better like this? Read me the bottom line. He noticed more than half a century ago that the small stores in small town America were disappearing. Not because of the big box stores. In fact, when he noticed this half a century ago, Sam Walton was still running out of a single small store in Missouri. So the big boxes were half a century away. It was the rise of the chain stores that Steinbeck noticed more than half a century ago. Now, when Steinbeck grew up in Salinas, California, this is 1900, but virtually every American was familiar with this scene. This would have been familiar to virtually every American, coast to coast. Whether you went into a store like that every day or once a week, whether you grew up with a store like that, your parents certainly did, wherever you were in America. Wherever you were in America. So what happens? This is a staple in everyone's life. This is where somebody would go in their town to get whatever it was they needed. There were no chain supermarkets, so this is where you would go. So what happens? Well, why don't we fast forward 50 years, as we said, was where it started, right? So by the end of the Second World War, you have a huge financial boom. There's a housing shortage, but there's a financial boom. So there's a new level of affluence for most Americans, certainly not all. There never has been for all, but there is a financial boom. And by 1950, for the very first time, a majority of Americans own an automobile. Game changer. Game changer. On so many levels. On what happens to the nuclear family, on how people approach work, how people approach moving to take a different job, and especially in terms of personal mobility. That's the big thing. And within 20 years of this, you have this. So you have all those cars, you have all that mobility, people want to go more places, and you have the rise and the mushrooming of the interstate highway system. And what that means now is, remember that little general store? So if this is the choice that you're offered in your town where you grow up, and now you have a car that's parked out in front of your house, and if you want to go get maybe something more than a quart of milk and maybe combine it with grabbing a few other things you need, you can hop on the highway and you have this. And if this is what you have in your town and you can go drive to that, why do you need this? But a funny thing happened on the way to extinction. This is the central irony of what I found. It's what made me want to write the book. First, I was just curious about why it would be that general stores, but at that point, I wasn't thinking about writing a book. I was just curious. I thought maybe I'll do a chronicle story about why general stores seem also like the diner, which I've done many stories on, seem to be coming back. But when I started to explore it, started to investigate, started to research, I found this crazy irony. And then I said, oh, this is cool. So here's the irony. The same forces that we're talking about, right, that seem to be threatening general stores with complete extinction, end up being the same forces that help save them. Sounds like a paradox of some kind, right? So let me explain. Again, with the rise of mobility and cars and affluence, the boomer generation, in the late 60s, 70s, early 80s, they are now starting families of their own. And to accommodate this, the boomers, it's a huge generation. To accommodate this, the suburbs grow in a way, explosions. This is California, but this is played out coast to coast. The suburbs explode. In some places like suburban Atlanta, where the term exurbia is coined. Because it literally becomes, they overrun the boundary between urban, suburban, exurban. It's just one massive sprawl, right? And you have the rise of what I call these super suburban communities, where you have infrastructure that the boomers' parents could only have dreamed about. You have wonderful school systems and youth programs and community centers. And in the morning you drive to work, and you've got these big long boulevards with strip malls lining all the way, and you got your choice of 3 or 4 or 5 different places to grab whatever kind of coffee and breakfast, muffin, burrito, whatever the hell you want. Wow, it's got it all, right? It's got it all. And yet, believe it or not, there were a lot of people who found that living in these super suburban communities meant that something felt often like it was lacking. Curiously, it was community. So it turns out you can live cheek by jowl in a beautiful house with a swimming pool, and you still don't really feel like you're part of a community. And a lot of people felt that way. And somebody noticed that people miss this sense of community. It had everything to do with where we were at this time in American culture and life. By the time you get to the late 70s, early 80s, the sense of community, everything has a cost, right? Nothing happens without a reaction. So as people have more mobility, as I said, you have a mushrooming of families where 2 parents are working. This is good. This is good, because there needed to be more parity in the workforce, and we got that, okay? You have more families where 2 parents are working. You have more people who are moving around to take jobs. There's a sense of mobility to take a job wherever in the country you want. And the bottom line is that sense of community that people had grown up with, that Steinbeck had grown up with, is being diffused. And even if people couldn't put their finger on what it was they were missing it. And one brilliant American sociologist named Ray Oldenburg put his finger on what it was. Put his finger on what it was in the late 70s. He's an American sociologist in Florida. And it sounds so disarmingly simple what Ray Oldenburg found that when I tell you what it is, you say, well, yeah, I know that. But we didn't until Ray Oldenburg told us what the third place is in American life. And it has everything to do with why general stores today matter more than ever. Because what Ray Oldenburg found when he published his book and the results of his research, The Great Good Place, was that as mobile as we think we are, as much as we may move around, as much as we may travel, we Americans still, he found, spend the vast majority of our lives in one of only three places. First place, you might guess, home. Second place, work. The third place is where it gets interesting. The third place is not one single place. The third place can be one of many, many different kinds of places. But the point is, a third place has something in common with wherever you find a third place. Because a third place, it could be a house of worship. It could be a place where you get your hair done, a beauty salon or a barber shop. It could be a public library, God bless them. It could be a general store. But the key is, it could also be the corner bar. Right. But all kidding aside, the point is, a third place is where people actually are likely to know your name. Because a third place, all of the third places I just described, what they all have in common is they are places that are not work, they're not home, and we may go there to do a certain dedicated task, right? To pray or get a hair done or get a quart of milk or a carton of eggs or return a book or a cup of coffee. But when we go to a third place, we have, even if it's an unconscious expectation, to interact with people from our community, people we know, people who validate our own place in our community. It's comforting, it's grounding, it's anchoring. And what Ray Oldenburg found was, as these third places were disappearing, it didn't make people not need them, it just made them miss them. These kinds of third places where people go and they are this distinct place apart. They are this distinct place apart. And of course, Starbucks went and stole Ray Oldenburg's mantra, but I don't think he's ever gotten a penny from that. So what happens? Why does this relate to general stores? So by the late 70s, 80s, you have a lot of people in these suburban communities, suburbia for the most part, who feel like they are missing a sense of community as they are beginning their own families. And they, oddly enough, it's not like they all got together and formed a group to recover a lost sense of community. The odd thing is that people did this on their own. But they moved to smaller towns around New England. As they started their own families, they were determined that their children would have more of a sense of community than they were getting in these big, huge suburban areas. And so they moved to small towns all across New England. And when they got there, they found these wonderful third places. They said, yeah, this is why I moved here to a place like Barnard, Vermont, where the same general store that existed in 1945 was still humming in 1985 and was still going strong in 2005, the same place. And they said, this is why we came here. Then you get to about the year 2000. And then something happens that's not so good. It's kind of a perfect storm. So it turns out the general store owners, because a lot of these boomers who moved to these small towns to recover a sense of community, many of them bought general stores. It's why they get credit for kind of being the first wave that helped save general stores. And it turns out the general store owners have kind of a shelf life, if you will, for how long on average they own a general store. It turns out to be about 20 years. So by the time you get to about 2000, a lot of people are coming up on a time when they're ready to slow down. Maybe sell the store. Sell it to someone else who'd like to keep it going. Problem. The country experiences a terrible recession. Make matters worse, a year later, in 2001, in the wake of 9/11, tourism goes off in some places around New England almost 90%. And for a lot of general stores, including many others who depend on tourism, that was the kicker. And a tidal wave of general stores went up for sale in and around the same 8 to 10 year period. And a lot of them closed. A wave of them closed. This looked like maybe this was something that no matter how much people wanted to recover a sense of community, that the small, humble general store could not surmount. Could not surmount. So what happens is, around 2000, 2001, a number of villages, small towns around New England, including Barnard, which we saw those pictures of, realized that if no one is going to come forward to buy the town's general store, maybe they'd have to do it themselves. And so the first wave of general stores are saved by communities who come together to save the store. And South Ackworth, New Hampshire is a perfect example. South Ackworth, like, well, every store in the book has been around for at least 100 years. That was one key metric. Had to occupy the same physical footprint for all of that time and had to have never been anything but a general store. And 3/4 of the stores in the book have been around twice that long, more than 200 years. Like South Ackworth. Like South Ackworth. But in the wake of 9/11, the owners at that time in South Ackworth had actually bucked that trend. They'd owned the store for 37 years. Couldn't do it anymore. Store was on the market for almost a year and a half. Nobody wanted to buy it, or nobody could buy it singly. The economy wasn't doing well, especially in New Hampshire. The store closed. The store closed. It was closed for almost a year. But the town felt they could not abide having this heart of the community closed down. So they came together and they formed a co-op to collectively buy the store. They staffed it with a couple of people. Everybody else, just like a food co-op, everybody else put in a certain number of hours during the week, got a discount on their groceries from the store. They got donated labor to create a pizza oven in the back to create a new revenue stream, and they created these wonderful harvest dinners that today draw in visiting chefs from all over New England. And today, the South Ackworth Village store, because of this collective ownership, because it took a village, is thriving better than ever. And I hope the lights don't go out there anytime soon. But in North Shrewsbury, Vermont, one of my favorite stories of a village trying to save its store. And in this case, it wasn't the economy. It wasn't the economy that almost did them in. It was Mother Nature. Now, more on that. But when this picture was taken of Pierce's, Marjorie Pierce, right here, was already in her early 70s. And at that time, her family had already been owning and running Pierce's, the heart and soul of North Shrewsbury, Vermont, for almost 70 years. But by the time you get to the 90s, early 90s, Marjorie Pierce, if you're doing the math at home, is in her early 90s. And at this point, she would like nothing more than to simply take a little time off. What, are you going to begrudge a 94-year-old lady for taking a day off? Problem is that if Marjorie Pierce takes time off, there's nobody to run the store. Nonetheless, she can't do it anymore. She can't stay on her feet. She can't work the shelves. She closes the store because she simply can't do it. And for the next couple of years, she experiences an emotion that is somewhat new for her. Guilt. She feels terrible that the store has closed. She feels terrible. She feels stung personally every time she hears in idle conversation. Nobody wants to make her feel bad. They're not saying it to her, but nonetheless, she realizes how much people miss the store. So she calls up a very special friend of hers, who's a very special guy. He's one of my favorite New Englanders, Paul Brune. Paul Brune is the founder and the executive director of the Preservation Trust of Vermont. And what they started in Vermont, they now do all over America, which is to help cities and towns hold on to their history. Not there's anything wrong with nostalgia or sentimentality, but that's not why they do it. They do it because they have learned and have the data to prove it that municipalities, cities and towns that preserve their history, especially in a downtown center area, could be a historic Main Street or a historic shopping district or a historic theater or a general store. Cities and towns that hold on to the history they have found do much better economically over the long term than cities and towns that pave over their history. And so she called up Paul, and she didn't have any interest in talking about this kind of data. That wasn't it. But that's what Paul Brun is about. And she called up Paul. She said, Paul, I have to talk to you. So Paul jumped in his beat-up Prius, and he drove down from Burlington. And she said, Paul, I need to reopen the store. And he said, how are you going to do that, dear? She said, I'm not going to do it, you are. He said, what do you mean, Margie? She said, well, I'm going to make you an offer. I'm going to give you the store. And I'm going to give you $10,000, which is pretty much all the money I have, but I don't expect to need it too much more. And he said, Marjorie, that's very kind of you. But he said, I want to remind you that that's not what we do. We don't own properties outright. What we do, what we've always been about, what's the key to what we do is we help cities and towns invest in their own future. We help cities and towns take ownership of their own history. We don't own properties outright. It's not in our mission. We can't do it. We're not set up to do it. And she said, Paul, piffle. Make a long story short, I think it went back and forth a little bit for a little while, but a little while later, Paul was back in his beat-up Prius making his way back up to Burlington, and the Preservation Trust owned its first piece of property outright. As Paul put it, I couldn't say no to this lady. So he did come back down. He did come back down to Shrewsbury a couple of weeks later. He had asked that the local historical folks convene for a meeting, and he told them that, he said, it is true that I hold the deed to the store, but I'm not going to be down here. And they said, well, how's it going to work? He said, you're going to run the store. And they said, Paul, we're farmers. We're craftspeople. You know, I make macrame. You know, it was like, don't worry about it. So they've done this before. And for 2 years, the PTV mentored them, this wonderful group, like my friend Sally Deinzer, mentored them. They went off on field trips and learning programs at other general stores. They learned how to do inventory. They learned how to order groceries. They completely rehabbed the general store interior. I think inch for inch, this is the most quintessential interior of a general store you will ever find. It looks almost like a set for a general store, right? No, it's exactly like that. I sat in the red chair last November while I was visiting, and it looks exactly like that. Now, they raised money. They raised over $65,000. This is a town of under 900 people. That's a lot of money, right? Now, wasn't like there was no grousing. Just before they reopened the store, they did ask for another $2,000. Yeah, they wanted an emergency generator. And there was grousing. A lot of people said, well, Marjorie Pierce never needed an emergency generator. They said, yeah, but here's the thing. If we want this to be a genuine community gathering place, where the community knows through thick and thin, through the worst that a Vermont winter can throw at us, this store will be there, open for them, we need to be able to do that. And okay, they relented, they got the emergency generator, and in 2009 they reopened, and the beating heart of North Shrewsbury, Vermont was beating once again for 2 years. Right. I told you Mother Nature got involved. Right. So 2 years later, ironically, it wasn't the worst of a Vermont winter they got thrown at them. It was the worst of a Vermont August, because Hurricane Irene tore up the East Coast, and instead of going out to sea, which 99 times out of 100 it will do if a hurricane gets this far north, it made a very peculiar beeline west and north and tore into the Green Mountains. It had been downgraded to a tropical storm at that point, but you know what? If you're downgraded to a tropical storm pack at 67-mile-an-hour winds instead of the 75 of a hurricane, it doesn't really matter. You're still going to sweep away 200-year-old covered bridges like so much driftwood, and it did. And that first afternoon of Irene, the power went out all over Vermont. It was Vermont's worst natural disaster in its history. The power went out all over the state. The lights went out all over the state. Even in North Shrewsbury, Vermont, of course, except in one little spot. And Sally Deinzer and her crew went out late afternoon, and they tore through the howling winds and the flying debris, and they fired up that emergency generator, and the lights came on. And to hear Sally tell it, she said, you know what? By 4:30 that first day of Irene, she said, we looked out those windows, and she said, it looked like something out of Night of the Living Dead. She said, you saw people just coming up the streets. They were making their way for the light, and they got there, and the lights were on, and the coffee was hot, and the Wi-Fi was working, and the phones were working, and they were able to tell relatives that everything was okay. And curiously, nobody has ever bellyached about the generator again. Now, so we talk now about the first wave of general stores being saved by villages who came together to save it collectively, right? But some general stores, even through that same period, but more and more recently as the economy improved, didn't require the whole village. It just required one remarkable individual or two who was able, personally, to buy the store. And I call it, Honey, I Bought the Store, the chapter in the book. I like to point out that, you know, people here, this isn't too far away, Carlisle. You've been to Ferns, right? Yeah, you've been to Ferns. I like to joke that my friend Larry Beerfield is the only person in the chapter to have actually uttered those words verbatim to his lovely wife, Robin. Honey, I bought the store. Yeah. He's very lucky that Robin was okay with that and didn't say, I hope you still have the receipt, honey. Okay? Now, but my favorite Honey, I Bought the Store, yes, involves America's worst boss. If you were a fan of The Office, Hollywood star Steve Carell. Now, you know, Steve grew up in Acton, Massachusetts, right? He grew up in Acton, Massachusetts. Did you know that? No. Yeah, did you know that? He grew up in Acton, Massachusetts. And play a game with me right now. Close your eyes for a minute. Close your eyes for a minute. And imagine, if you will, a husband and wife who are the proud owners of a historic old New England general store. Husband and wife, and they own the general store. Got that image in your head? Okay, open your eyes. Does it look like this? No? I'm not surprised. And yet, you are looking at a husband and wife, the husband and wife owners of a historic old New England general store. So Steve grew up in Acton, okay? And when I interviewed Steve for the book, I asked him, where does your love for general stores come from? And he said, well, there was a general store in Acton, long gone, but it was the first place that he was allowed to go as a little boy on his bike with his little money jangling in the saddlebag and buy candy at the store all by himself. How many of you had the same experience? Right? I love that because I see so many people have had the same experience. I did too. Same for me. I grew up in Winthrop, Massachusetts, or as I like to refer to it, the charming little seaside town at the end of runway 27L. It was a very noisy childhood, let me tell you. But there was a little general store. It wasn't very rural, but it was a little variety store. The same thing. It was a place. And same was true for Steve's lovely wife, Nancy. She grew up on the South Shore. She grew up in Cohasset. And summer nights, all during the summers, she and her big sister Tish would go next door to Marshfield, to the Marshfield Hills General Store. And about 15 years ago, Nancy's big sister Tish went out to Hollywood, to LA, over Christmas time to visit her sister and her famous brother-in-law. And she told Nancy, Tish did, that guess what? The Marshfield Hills General Store is up for sale. And she said, who's going to buy it? She said, I don't know if anybody's going to buy it. She said, it's been on the market for months. Not only that, she pulled out kind of a ratty copy of the Boston Globe, and she said, look at this. She said, some local developer has proposed turning it into condos. And at that point, Steve said he heard this, and he went into the kitchen where they were talking, and again, to make a long story short, when Nancy's sister Tish returned to Boston after her visit, she had with her a check to purchase the Marshfield Hills General Store, which she did. And I think that the Carells, Steve and Nancy and Tish and their design team, I think they did an amazing. It is a truly historic general store. It really is. It is one of the few remaining general stores in New England that still has an attached working post office. That used to be the case at all general stores. Every general store owner was also the town postmaster. Very rare today. Very rare. Still is the case in Marshfield. During the Civil War, Union Army uniforms was stitched on the 3rd floor. And I think that they did a great job. Tell me what you think. I think they did a great job of preserving that store exactly as it looks, right? And Steve did, in fact, make his sister-in-law, Tish, the general manager of the store. And the Corrals today own a house in Cohasset. They come out every summer for a few weeks. They spend a lot of time at the store. And today, no summer in Marshfield Hills is complete without a confirmed Corral sighting. And there he is. Now, so we've talked about... Did we get to the questions already? You didn't even raise your hand, young lady. Go ahead. Go ahead. But if I don't remember where I was, you're in so much trouble. I'm kidding you. What's your question? What's your question?
It seems that you did an episode on him in the General Store Chronicle.
I did. Not years ago. Last fall. It was about this book. Way back? No, it could be. On Corral and the Marshfield Hills? Possible. I didn't do it. The show might have done it. Yeah, because I first met him when we did the store, and that was actually the first time I was there. Any other questions? A follow-up? I'm kidding. And I will make time for questions, I promise. So if you're thinking of one, hold on to it. So we've talked about how the first general stores were saved by, collectively, people coming together. We talked about how some remarkable individuals were able to save a store all by themselves. But as I put this talk together, I felt like it was important to recognize and sort of pay some homage, if you will, to some general stores, and there are many of them, that are so ingrained in the fabric of their community, that enjoy such support from their community, that they've never been threatened. They've never been up for sale. They've never had to. And I call them these stores that are kind of tried and true. And I'll share one with you because I did feel like it was important to recognize some of these stores. All general stores have not been threatened. The reason why some have not been threatened is really worth paying some attention to, because these are communities where they just support the store to the extent that it's never been threatened. One of my favorites is the Warren store. Anybody ever been to the Warren store in Warren, Vermont? Ever had a sandwich from there? Yeah? Yeah. Those will last you a while, huh? I measure the Warren store sandwiches in mileage. Like there are certain sandwiches that'll last me like 50 miles, right? And the Warren store is up in Warren, Vermont. Like most of these stores, it's been around for over 200 years. And it is up in ski country, kind of equidistant between Waitsfield and Warren, so kind of between Sugarbush and Mad River Glen. And it is the heart and soul of Warren, Vermont. It is the heart and soul of Warren, Vermont. It is just the kind of place that if you're within 25 miles of Warren and live around there, you spend time in the Warren store. And the last time I was at the Warren store was, I was just realizing this last night, was just over 2 years ago. It was in March of 2016. You may recall, whether you want to or not, it was a presidential election year. Not going to comment further. And so that was when I was there. And I went in and I said hi to my friend Jack Garvin, who runs the store. And I said, Jack, what's new? And he said, oh, let's see. Oh, he said, we're having some fun right now. Maybe you'd like to pitch in? He said, we're having a contest to name the stove. So almost every general store has some type of wood stove. The Warren store has a wood stove on steroids. It's huge. It's the central defining characteristic of the Warren store, right? It's huge. It's almost floor to ceiling. And they were having a contest to give the stove a name. And I said, wow, have you had any good candidates for a new name? And he said, aha. He said, funny you should use that word. So it turns out that just a week before I'd been there, that another longtime friend of the store had popped in. And I don't know where he found the time, because he was pretty busy at that point in time. He may have been back in Burlington doing laundry for all I know, but he popped into the store, and Jack told him about the contest, and he, thinking quicker on his feet than me, had an idea. He had a suggestion to offer. He said, I have an idea. And they liked it. He won. He won. You know, I've always wondered if on some level that even in the disappointment for Bernie Sanders of not winning the Democratic presidential nomination, if there were times late at night back in Vermont that he thought, well, I did win the stove naming contest, the Lawrence Star, and Hillary didn't. So maybe. I always like to think maybe that gave him some comfort. But there are also stores that I like to point out are all of the above. They have had unending support from their communities. They are tried and true. They are also one of a kind. That's what makes them truly unique, as you'll see in one case, in all the world. Now, one of my favorites, one of a kind, where you will find nothing else quite like it, is in Norwich, Vermont, which is right over the Connecticut River from Hanover, New Hampshire, right? So the Upper Valley area of New Hampshire and eastern Vermont, where you'll find Dan and Witt's. Now, Dan and Witt were not the original owners of the store. They were high school buddies who worked at the store in the 1930s when they were in high school, and then by the 1950s, they owned the store. And they hung a sign, which you will find in most general stores. The difference at Dan and Witt's is that it may actually be true. So here's what happened. So Dan and Witt did very well. They did very well. They were really kind of savvy guys for the time. They did very well, and they wanted to expand. The problem was there was no way to expand on the footprint out in front where people would see. Because right over here on this side, you have the Norwich Inn, and you have a street right here. So they couldn't expand out front. But they did have 3/4 of an acre in back. It's a very narrow kind of footprint, but it extends back in the same shape of the store here, right back for almost 3/4 of an acre. So that's what they did. So it's very curious, because if you look at the store, it doesn't look that big. In fact, if you walk in, it really doesn't look that big. I'll tell you what, from the front door to where that guy and his son are standing at the refrigerators is not even as far back as the back wall of this room. Only about 3/4 of the way back. So it's not that big when you walk in. But if you walk just to the left of where they are, over by the butcher counter, the meat counter, you'll find a doorway, open doorway. There's no door, there's no sign. But if you go through that, you're in the back. The fabled back. And by the way, it doesn't end there either. As you can tell, it just continues back for 3/4 of an acre in a store. In fact, the ceiling looks much like you'd find in a big box store now, okay? It is enormous. And these aisles, it's like a maze. In fact, it's very much like a maze. And the same way that you could get lost in a corn maze, you can get lost in the back. And I'm big enough to admit that I did. First time I was out there with Dan Frazier, the original Dan's grandson, and it was a late winter day and it was getting dark, and he said, you know what, I gotta run out to the front, there's no one covering, but you're welcome to walk around. I said, great, and I walked around. And then when I had enough, I couldn't find my way out. Every way I went, I said, you gotta be kidding me. And it's embarrassing at a certain point, because it's not like you don't know where you are. You know you're in a store in Norwich, Vermont. You still ain't getting out, right? And so I wasn't going to help. So I did finally get out. And I said to Dan, I said, Dan, I just got lost in the back. And he said, oh, it happens all the time. I said, what do you mean? He said, oh, probably once, twice a week. We find some kid back there after we close. So it turns out at Dan and Witt's, they've crafted an interesting way to deal with this. They have the equivalent of the ski patrol in a store. There's no other way to describe it. You know, at a ski area, when the lifts close, at generally 3:34, 4:30, when the lifts close, they send the ski patrol out. And they flush out all the trails, right? Because you want to make sure that, God forbid, nobody's hurt and left there after dark. They do the same thing at Dan and Witt's. So at 9 o'clock every night when the store closes, they send someone out in the back. And they make sure no one's there. And I said, you ever find? He said, yeah. We find like a 10-year-old kid there all the time. I said, not the same kid. He said, no, different kids. I said, well, that's terrible. He said, yeah. He said, you know what's really kind of odd, though? He said, half the time we know for a fact that their parents left like an hour ago. Yeah, right? So this is my other one-of-a-kind. And this one-of-a-kind general store can truly be called there's nothing else like it in the world. So it may not look like that special or extraordinary. When Harlan Hussey started it, it looks like Hussey, but he was a German immigrant, pronounced it Hussey. And when he started out as just a very humble, almost like it was a one-floor kind of garage-like general store. And like Dan and Witz, it did very well. It did very well, and Harlan Hussey was able to expand, and by the late 50s, he had expanded to this 3-floor commercial colossus of Windsor, Maine. Now, it's what is sold in this store in combination that makes it unique in all the world. So you will find a guide sign when you walk into the first floor of Hussey's. Start reading the guide sign at the bottom to achieve maximum impact, okay? So this is what you're faced with, right? So nothing so unordinary. Wood stoves, home and garden, plumbing, electrical paint, hardware, camping gear, fishing, hunting supplies, guns, bridal gowns, clothing. Whoa, what? What? Right. So Hussey's in Windsor, Maine, it turns out, is the only general store on the face of the earth where you can buy guns, gowns, and beer. Or basically, you're one-stop shopping for a shotgun wedding. Which is exactly what Harlan Hussey's granddaughter did for her wedding photo. There she is. There's the lovely bride holding her wedding bouquet, a 6-pack of Schlitz, and the groom is holding a brand new 12-gauge. Now, okay, since we're having too much fun, to get a little bit serious here at the end, I've talked about questions, you know, and so when I started doing this talk about 6-7 months ago now, I would open up to questions at the end, and I found, like, invariably that somebody would ask me, if not the first question, the second or third. And then I started, after a few weeks, I was like waiting for it. So they would ask me if I had a favorite general store. Was there one general store? Logical question, right? If I had a favorite general store. And what I also found as time went on was that it was the same general store. Like, it was the same general store. So then I started to think, why is this my favorite general store? And so the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it's worth sharing with people why it's my favorite general store, because it goes to so much of what we're talking about tonight, because the magic word, you've probably guessed by now, is community. And it goes to it in a way that almost no other general store does. It is not extraordinary in any physical sense. It is not dramatically different physically than any other general store. It doesn't sell anything, singly or in combination, that makes it extraordinary. It makes a great BLT, but so does the Harrisville store in Harrisville, New Hampshire. So why would it be? Well, quite simply, the Putney General Store in Putney, Vermont, is the Rocky of general stores. The Rocky of general stores. It has been beaten down so many times in such really brutal ways, and it keeps getting back up. Not by itself, obviously, but by a community that refuses to let go of its beloved general store, because that's the community of Putney, Vermont. And I have a soft spot for underdogs. I realize that's part of this too, you know. In many of my stories, whether it is a person who has overcome incredible odds, or whether it is a city or town, a mill town or a waterfront town that has had to fight back and reinvent itself once its heyday went away, or a general store. And it is the ultimate, ultimate, ultimate underdog. As I said, there's nothing extraordinary about its history in the sense of it being around for a long time, like all the other general stores. Putney and the 3/4 of those stores has been around for over 200 years, 1797. A.M. Corser, just one of 14 different owners over that 200-plus year period of time, and it has occupied the same spot in Putney. Just above Little Sackett's Brook, you will find the Putney General Store, except at a couple of times in its history when you didn't find it there. How could that be? Well, the first time, I think you'll see right away, was on May 3rd, 2008, when some faulty wiring in the attic caused a fire to break out about 1 o'clock in the morning, and thank goodness for volunteer fire departments. Because you know, in small towns with volunteer fire departments, you do not have people at the station house. There are not boots lined up with the suspenders and pants pulled down to jump into and go down the pole and get on the truck. You have to muster the fire department. And fires only go out as fast as the crew can be mustered. And they responded very quickly. They responded very quickly that night in 2008, and they were able to save essentially almost 2/3 of the building. And it fell to some wonderful locals, like my friend Lisa Papazian of the local Historical Society, and she made her first call the next morning to our good friend, Paul Brune. And Paul got in his beat-up Prius, and he drove down from Burlington. It's like the Batmobile. Yeah? They should just have a searchlight that has a B on it. And he came down, and he sussed it all out, and he said, all right, here's the first problem. You people have to take ownership of this building. That's how we're going to do this. You, the local Historical Society, are going to become the owners of the General Store. And he worked with Bernie Sanders and Pat Leahy and the governor, and they got federal funding and some state funding and matching grants. They raised local funds, and they were able to reopen the Putney General Store. They were able to rebuild it. Yeah, and you hear great stories about how when the roof went on, people came to a stop wherever they were driving. Cars were honking and honking because it was like the town was becoming whole again. And the store reopened, and all was good in Putney, Vermont, and the beating heart of Putney was beating once again. Unfortunately, only for a year and a half. I told you it was Rocky, right? So it's not like Apollo Creed lets Rocky up off the mat, right? So it's bad. It was a total loss. It was a total loss. It's a total loss. It burned down right down to the foundation stones. Nothing left but soaking soot and some steam. Right. And as bad as that looks, it's so much worse. How could it be worse than the fact that it's a total loss? Well, this time there was no faulty wiring, but there was massive accelerant found throughout the building. Arson. So this was a double brutal gut punch to the small town of Putney, population 967 people. Because now not only did they wake up the next day and have to contend with the reality, the awful reality that they had just lost the heart and soul of their town, they had to contend with the dual awful reality, if not worse, that the person who did this awful thing may be their neighbor. Who knows? Who knows? And it felt for many people like a death in the family. And it was, in a very real way, because the Putney store was like extended family to everybody in that town. And that, late that night, almost early the next morning, Lisa Papazian, choking sobs. Paul said he answered the phone. He had no idea if somebody he knew had just died in a car crash, because all he heard was somebody who couldn't speak, who was sobbing too hard. It was Lisa Papazian calling Paul Brune. And Paul came back. He drove in the middle of the night. He got to Putney. He slept in his car for a few hours to be there when the Historical Society met him at the church across the street where the store had stood. And they talked. And there was a lot of anguish and a lot of tears. Within about half an hour, about 50 more people who had heard about this meeting showed up. Within another hour, there were over 150 people from town. They had to move the meeting out into the cold open air. And there were more tears, more anguish, more frustration. And finally, an older gentleman whose family went back 5 generations in Putney stood up on the low stone wall that's right by the street there, and he said, I have one thing to say. I will be goddamned if an arsonist is going to define my town. And Paul Brune kind of let those words sit in the chill air. He waited a good long couple of minutes, and he stood up, and he said, well, that sounds to me like we need to rebuild. And they did. And if there was one single kind of silver lining from this horrible thing, it was this. This was such an incredible bad luck for this small town. A year and a half after they rebuilt their store, it burns again, that it made national news all over the country and the world. It led nightly newscasts. It was on the front page of major newspapers all over America. And the only silver lining was, this time, money poured into Putney. And they were able to rebuild the store in a way they hadn't before. They were actually able to enlarge it somewhat. A local sawyer donated his time to cut the timber that had also been donated. They rebuilt the store. It was gleaming brand new. They needed someone to run the store. Remember, the Historical Society owned it, but they didn't run it. They needed someone to run it, and they had a wonderful good fortune. A local man, a pharmacist, an immigrant who had brought his family to Putney, Vermont about 15 years earlier, and he felt that the store had been like family in accepting him and his family. And he said, if I can run my pharmacy off the second floor, I'm happy to run the general store. And they said, great. And all was good once again, and the store was, and the town were whole once again, until New Year's Day 2017. No fire, no fire, no fire. But on New Year's Day, Happy New Year, on New Year's Day 2017, this lovely gentleman died. And neither of his two children wanted anything to do with running the store. So it closed again. And Paul Brune this time called Lisa Papazian. And he told her, he said, Lisa, I'm very sorry for your loss, but I'm going to tell you something. You got to reopen the store. She said, Paul, how are we going to do that? We don't have someone to run it. He said, no, 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 no. How many people do you have in the Historical Society now? She said, 41. He said, good. Everybody takes an hour a week. You reopen the store. Because he told her, and he said, I have the data to prove it. The longer that store stays closed, the longer it will be before it reopens. And they came together. They formed a skeletal crew. They reopened the store last May. I was there in November, and Lisa Papazian made my BLT. And the store reopened. It is open now. It is running again. And as Paul Brune says, it is truly about perseverance in Putney. But as I finish, you know, this feel-good stuff that we've been talking about should not obscure the fact that all throughout, general stores still close in New England. And no closure has been sort of more heart-wrenching than in 2012, just 6 years ago, when Gray's in Adamsville, Little Compton, Rhode Island, closed. At that point, it was the longest continuously operating general store in America. 224 years. That's just 12 years less than the country had been in business. But it closed. It closed. And just to show you how this doesn't stop, stores closing, the reason why I have such a wonderful photograph by my photographer for the book, Art Donahue, is that the Monterey General Store is in the book. Only a month after the book released, it closed. Right. So I tell you this by way of, these stores still need to be saved. And none of them will exist in 20 years. None of them. Not even Putney. If it weren't for a new breed of general store owners. So as I finish, I feel it's important to point out and give these people some credit. I'm going to just show you one couple that's doing it. But there is a new breed of general store owners. And they are realizing the importance of community in a way that you might not think younger people might today. You might not think that millennials, you know, those who sort of came of age with their cell phones and devices, would feel the same way about community that their parents do or their grandparents do. But there are wonderful younger people who do. And they've realized that you have to make a general store today serve and fit its community. Its community. You know, there's no better example than in Whitefield, Maine, at Sheepscot General Store, which had been closed for almost 30 years before Ben and Taryn Marcus reopened it. Now, I will grant you, they may look a little more like a general store couple owners than Steve and Nancy Carell, but looks are deceiving because they had no interest whatsoever in owning and running a general store. They're farmers. They met at agriculture school in Washington State. Ben was from Whitefield, so when they graduated, they moved back to Maine, and their hope was to be able to afford to be able to buy a few acres of land that they could farm, but they couldn't afford it. Kept looking, couldn't afford it. So one day a guy from Whitefield came up to them and he said, I know you're looking for some land. He said, I'm going to make you a crazy offer. He said, I will give you free 5 acres of prime farmland. And they said, what's the catch? Ah, the catch. He said, the catch is there is a long-closed, defunct general store on that property, Sheepscot General. It used to be the heart and soul of Whitefield, Maine, but it's been closed almost 30 years. I've always thought maybe I would reopen it, but I don't think that's going to happen. But if you will reopen and run the store, the land is yours. And they still deliberated. That's how much they didn't want to run a general store. So they hedged their bets. They only bought stuff for the store as they inventoried it out. They only bought stuff for the store that they personally liked, especially food. They only bought food that they like to eat. No, because their thinking was, when this whole crazy thing goes south, we can personally liquidate the inventory. We won't have to go food shopping for a year and a half. But that didn't happen. That didn't happen. Oh, the land produced all right. Incredible organic produce. And after about 6 months, Ben and Taryn looked at each other. They said, you know, wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to drive hundreds of miles every week to hit every single farmer's market in southern New England, which is what you have to do as a farmer today, for the most part. So they said, what if we could open like a little cafe at the store and find a wonderful chef to run the cafe with our produce? And they did. And it caught on. And suddenly Sheepscot General Store was humming in a whole new way. And I grant you, if you had last been in Sheepscot General 100 years ago and you walked in, well, I grant you, you would wonder, what's this little kid doing? Then you would wonder, why is there a wine tasting and what is an open mic? In fact, what is a mic? Right? So that's true. It's not the general store of 100 years ago. But guess what? This is the future of general stores. The new breed of general store owners realize you have to serve your community. And I know that Marnie would bear this out when it comes to public libraries. Public libraries today, more than ever before, right, have to serve their communities with programming and services that is central and vital and particular to their community. You know, what works here in Burlington at the library will not necessarily work in East Boston, where you have an immigrant population of more than 80%. That's okay. That's okay. But you have to serve your community. Same is true of general stores. So they realize, you know, what else do we need here? Well, there's no library within 45 miles. So they opened a lending library. They started daycare. They started yoga classes. Crazy for a general store, but it works. It's what keeps the store open. And today, Sheepscot General is, again, the beating heart of Whitefield, Maine, in a way it hadn't been for 35 years. And it's popular with young and with old. And it gives hope once again. It gives, as what could give hope more than the reopening of Hope General Store in Hope, Maine in 2016, that because of this new breed, I think that the future of many general stores will be preserved. And that is New England General Stores.